station. Any unattended articles are likely to be removed without warning.
This is the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman. The Hour of History Cities podcast, as well as other Hour of History podcasts, can be streamed and downloaded at hourofhistory.com, iTunes, Google Music, our YouTube channel, and TuneIn. Be sure to also check out our Hour of History blog at hourofhistory.com/blog. And now we begin the Hour of History Cities podcast with your host, Stephen Bauman.
Hello, welcome to Hour of History Cities podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Bauman, and we have 4 items left to finish up the history of the city, Havana, Cuba. Now, it's been quite a while since we started, and we've come on quite a journey from the original indigenous groups, the Taino, to Spanish colonization, when the capital moved from Santiago to Havana, and Havana became a city of world importance through trade, through slavery, through hard work and production of commodities like sugar and tobacco, all the way up to these enormous tourist economy, American influence, dictatorial rule by Fulgencio Batista, and a revolution led by a lawyer named Fidel Castro. And now, after this revolution has taken place, we enter into post-revolutionary Cuba, the current regime that's still in power in Cuba, and I have 4 items left to get us to the present day. This week, the 2 items I choose are coffee and urban farming. Hopefully these are of great interest to you. They are items I thought about for a long time because it's difficult to represent this entire revolution, both the good thing and the bad things that happen from it. The new Cuba, there's been a lot written about it, enormous amounts of polarized thought on the issue depending on which way you fall. People who have been forced to leave their homes, people who have been given new homes. So, let's get started. So why would I choose coffee and urban farming? Well, it goes back, of course, to the Spanish and the institutions that were created in order to cultivate coffee, which is a crop that could be sold, it could be consumed. It was a valuable crop, and Havana is a coffee producing region. Under the Spanish, obviously, the markets were more in Spain. After the Haitian Revolution, Cuba, like in sugar and tobacco, becomes a more important coffee production location. But what does it have to do with the revolution? Well, after the Bay of Pigs, the United States and the failed invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs, Cuban-U.S. relations get worse. Fidel Castro declares Cuba as a socialist state. This is at the height of the Cold War. The United States extends its embargo in 1962, and the Cuban Missile Crisis takes place in October. So between 59 and 62, there's no more commercial flights between Havana and Miami, and almost 250,000 people leave Cuba to get to the United States. 3 years later, Castro again announces any Cuban wishing to leave can go to the United States. So another 3,000 Cubans go. There's what are called freedom flights between Varadero and Miami. And basically enormous emigration from Cuba, enormous shift in population. And this is Castro's way of sort of setting up this new revolution. Kind of, if you aren't with me, well, then just leave. In Havana, a result of this revolution, a result of the sort of peasantization of the city that I talked about last week, is also the development of new industries. So rather than have all the coffee cultivated outside of Havana, Havana is a coffee cultivating region, the government wanted to start a program called the Cordón de la Habana, or the Greenbelt, the Havana Greenbelt. And the goal of this was to plant fruit, trees, coffees, and peas in a sort of greenbelt around and inside of Havana. Now, we would call this today an urban farming project, and it's been, it has been, written about numerous times. It didn't produce the numbers that Castro imagined it would. It didn't create the sort of farming successes that it was hoped. The goal was, people would grow their own food and be able to consume it in Havana rather than having to produce food outside of the city and ship it into the city. Now, when it started in 1968 and in the 70s, the subsequent years, Cuba was under huge subsidies from the Soviet Union and was still producing cash crops like sugar and sending those en masse to the Soviet Union. So this was to sort of alleviate some of that pressure. Now, interestingly, while it didn't go so well in the 70s, there's now, been sort of a resurgence of research about these urban spaces as the world is becoming more interested about sort of alternatives to farms that are grown, farmers in New Jersey sending all their food to, say, New York, or New Yorkers eating oranges from Miami, things like that, when New York is certainly capable of growing its own food. So this green belt in Havana, while it wasn't an immediate success, it certainly did offer the world a sort of alternative example, a way of growing agriculture within city limits. Now, and this sort of thing can still be seen today. One of the other reasons Cuba had to do this and Havana had to sort of improvise was because of the embargo. So with the embargo, less agriculture was coming in from the United States and less was being grown to send out. Also, less products such as trucks, and especially when the Soviet Union dissolves, Cuba just lacks parts for the Soviet machines it has. It lacks parts for the American machines it has. So there aren't many tractors and things like that. So small urban farms really lend themselves to people farming on their own. Now, like I said, it's not wildly successful. There's a lot of problems with urban farming, including the quality of the soil, the access to resources, the climate, things like that still have to be considered. And there's a reason urban farming is hard to get off the ground. So it's not a wildly successful program. And coffee is one of those examples. So coffee is a product that could potentially, theoretically, be grown in Havana in urban sort of farm, but it doesn't really work that way. The coffee production of Havana never meets up with this sort of enormous coffee consumption that the Cubans are used to. Certainly, before the revolution, something like 60,000 tons of coffee was exported from Cuba every year, and currently it's around 6,000 tons. So the coffee production or export goes way down. The amount that's actually grown for people to consume also goes down, and there's not enough money and it's also blocked with the embargo, importing coffee. So a lot of the famous espresso brands that you see in the supermarkets in the United States, like Pilar or Bustelo, those are brands that are created by Cuban immigrants. Bustelo created in Queens, and Pilar in Miami, and Café El Moro. I mean, there's a lot of these coffees that are basically created by the Cuban immigrants to the United States. And so these are sort of, they've continued the tradition from pre-revolutionary Cuba, and they've become the de facto sort of Cuban coffee. And typically these coffees are cooked on a mocha pot on the stove, an espresso pot that you can make, just on a stove. Well, these coffees are gone after the revolution, and there's not enough coffee being produced in Cuba, so it creates kind of, again, a necessity for invention. And one of the ways coffee is consumed post-revolution when times get tough is called café con chicharro, which is coffee and chickpeas. So by putting chickpeas and mixing it with ground coffee, so say someone can spend their money, their ration, and get some Café Bustelo that got into Cuba, or maybe they get it through the black informal economy. They get some American Café Bustelo, and they mix it with chickpeas, Café con Chicharro. And this is how Cubans sort of get around the scarcity of actual coffee from projects that didn't go as planned, like the Cordón de la Habana. Now, coffee is enormously important in Cuban culture, and especially in revolutionary culture as well. Not only is coffee, something that we enjoy, it wakes us up, it's easy to consume, but there's also the sense of community and socialization that happens through the production of coffee. And since Havana is not a highly commercialized society by any sense of the imagination, I mean, there's no private business under the revolution, what happens is people who find coffee, or who have enough coffee, or in any way are able to procure coffee, start these sort of like informal window markets. And so they'll cook coffee on their moka pot in their home, they'll open their window, and then people from the neighborhood will come to this window and get coffee in a tiny little tacita, a little cup, a very little cup, like you might expect for an espresso beverage. Now, this also plays into the revolution, because one of the creations of the revolution is the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, or Committees for the Defense of the Revolution. So these committees are neighborhood, like we could think of them as like hyper aggressive neighborhood watch organizations. And by aggressive, I mean they're tasked with defending the revolution, and in a lot of cases they're able to decide exactly what that means. So you might imagine some of these leaders of the CDR, the Committee for the Defense of the Revolution, going up to these windows and having their morning coffee, and this is where the gossip is taking place. You know, you say the wrong thing at morning coffee, and you're not going to be doing too well in the eyes of the leaders of the defense of the revolution. So coffee is in every neighborhood. It's not always the same high quality coffee, but it still exists. It doesn't matter how good it is, right? Because the purpose at a certain point is the socialization. And these these committees for the revolution that are, in the words of Fidel Castro, en cada barrio revolución. In every neighborhood, there's going to be revolution. And a lot of the ways these revolutionary ideas and checks on counter-revolutionaries are spread are through the morning coffee and the socialization that's created through coffee. So we have now, you know, this representative urban farming, an example of some of the innovations of revolution that tried to counteract some of the big mass market things that had happened before. And we have coffee, a commodity that continues to be consumed widely, you know, inside and outside of Havana, that also plays a central role in sort of the growth and continuation of the revolution. So next week is episode 10 and the final episode of this cities series. We're going to somehow bring Havana to the present from these revolutionary ideas through some rather tough years and potentially to a future that might be a little bit brighter. So thanks for listening, and remember, Hour of History, our world, anytime, any place.